Sunday school are up. If there's a title for today's thoughts, I would put it as "You are what you do." You are what you do. We're going to particularly look at the account of one specific person, really, to illustrate that point, maybe a few others. A chap called Ahithophel. No, Ahithophel. That's it. I know I was going to get it wrong. Been practicing it all week. I was going to get it wrong. Ahithophel. Ahithophel may be a name that you've heard before, maybe a name you've never heard, but by the end of this morning, you're going to know all about Ahithophel and his story, and hopefully a few things maybe that it can teach us. And you're going to hear me say Ahithophel about 100 times, so you're going to be able to say it by the end of the morning as well. So we'll open up in 2 Samuel chapter 16, just to see a little idea of who Ahithophel was. And it was a quote I read on that point of "You are what you do," and it's a quote by a Greek philosopher actually called Plutarch, who was around in about 70 AD, so he was around at the time of the early church. But he said a quote which I really enjoyed, which is, "Character is simply a habit long continued." So the habits that you perform, the habits that you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, that is what makes up your character. You are what you do. And let's see who Ahithophel was. We'll just read one verse. So we are going to jump around a little bit today, back and forward, just to get the full picture, the full story here of Ahithophel. So 2 Samuel 16, verse 23 to start, it says, "And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counselled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom." So Ahithophel was a counselor. He was an advisor. He was a man who gave advice. And the wisdom that he gave, it says here, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God, had asked at the mouth of God, it says, of his advice and his counsel. That was, I believe it's talking about the reliability and the accuracy of his advice. So this man, if you had a situation and you had a dilemma, you wanted to know what to do, you wanted advice, Ahithophel was the man to go to. He was spot on every time with the right answer, the right thing to do. I think we all wish we had a friend like Ahithophel that you could go to, and you have your little dilemma in life and you don't know what to do, and every time he just gives you the spot on right answer. And of course it compares him to God here, and that's our oracle, that's our counselor, that's our advisor, is the Lord that we go to, and we know that his counsel is never going to lead us wrong. But was this his character, Ahithophel, or was this just his nature? It was certainly his nature, was that he was a man who had this wisdom. He had the knowledge of what to do in every situation, and every time you went to him, he would be able to tell you this is what you should do, and he would be bang on right every single time. We'll turn back to 2 Samuel 15. And so just a little bit of backstory here, a little bit of context. So it mentioned there the counsel of Ahithophel with David and Absalom. So David was one of Absalom was one of David's sons, and Absalom, there's a whole load of story before this, but basically Absalom had been brought back into the good graces of David after doing some wrong things, but David had forgiven him. But he repaid that forgiveness by basically trying to turn the whole of Israel against David. So he'd been subtly working against David, trying to win over the hearts of the people, and he did it successfully. And it got to the point where David sort of realized that, okay, the jig is up here. I've lost the hearts of the people, and Absalom's going to take over. and I need to just get out of here. So David flees. David gets out of Jerusalem, and yeah, he flees basically into the country, and Absalom now takes over, and he's in charge. And in 2 Samuel 15 and verse 12, it says, "And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword." So it was at this moment, really, when it was the turning point, when David heard that Ahithophel, previously his close advisor, the man he would go to and rely upon to tell him what to do, he turned and he betrayed David, and he went over to the other side. And it was that point when David knew, okay, things are really, really wrong here. Things are really wrong, because his closest guy had now flipped to the other side. And it reminds me of, you see it in the governments of the day, when the closest person turns to the leader, you know the things are going to crumble. You know, we've seen it multiple times, even in this nation. You know, you can see when things are going wrong at the top, and you know things are going to fall apart at some point, but you don't know how, or you don't know when. And a lot of the time, it's actually when a key ally to the leader quits, or turns to the other side, that sets off the final fall. If you remember, what did for Boris was when Rishi Sunak, his chancellor, quit, and that was sort of the beginning of the end for Boris. Is what did for Liz Truss when the Home Secretary quit as well, and then that was again the beginning of the end for her. It's what did for Thatcher when a Deputy Prime Minister quit, and that was again the beginning of the end for her. So we see it time and time again in the world. When the closest advisor, when the person who's meant to be the ally of the leader goes off, that's it. It's the beginning of the end, and that's what David knew. Ahithophel defecting to Absalom, that was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back, really, for David, and it was what finally turned the hearts of the people, because they saw, okay, the wisdom, the advice, the great counselor is now no longer with David. It's now with Absalom. And if you go down to verse 31, it says, "And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." David knew how valuable that advice and counsel of Ahithophel was. That advice and counsel could make or break a king. It could make or break a leader, because he was, as inquiring at the oracles of God, he always got it right. And if we go to Psalm 55, we can perhaps see a little bit about how David felt about this. So Psalm 55, this is a Psalm of David. And it's a sort of a bit of a psalm of pouring it all out to the Lord. You know, David was a man, he wore his heart on his sleeve. He didn't keep his emotions all buckled up, no stiff upper lip. He let it all out. And he's talking here about a betrayal. And unfortunately for David, there's a few possible options of who it could be. He got betrayed by a few people in his life. But the Jews, the rabbis, they understood this psalm to be about Ahithophel, about David's advisor. And we read from verse 12 in Psalm 55, "For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked unto the house of God in company. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. So David, he knew what it was like to be betrayed, and he also knew where to put his trust. And many of us may have experienced that feeling of being let down by someone who you thought you could trust, who you thought might be on your side, who you thought might have your back. And then there might be a moment or an incident or a situation where you realize, that person's not who I thought they were, or they didn't have my back. I put my trust in them and they broke my trust. I betrayed them, and it hurts. It hurts when that happens. Few things hurt like that. It really does feel like a stab in the back emotionally. But David knew what to do in that situation. And what did he do? He turned to God and he turned to prayer. As for me, I will call upon the Lord, and the Lord shall save me. That was where he knew his answer was. Evening, morning, and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. With confidence, David spoke. He knew that time spent in prayer to the Lord, in pouring out his heart, in crying out to God, telling God his pain, telling God his fears, his worries, and rightfully so. He had a lot of them, but he had that confidence that the Lord would hear his voice. And he said, he hath delivered, verse 18, in my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. So David had that assurance in God that when he prayed to the Lord, as he did in what we just read in 2 Samuel, to turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness, it wasn't a vain prayer. It wasn't an empty prayer. That was a prayer of confidence, that even though everything seemed to be turning against him in that moment, David knew that he had something on his side that Absalom didn't, and that was the Lord. That was the Lord. Absalom may have had the closest thing in the natural that he could have got to God, this man who had all the answers, but David had the real thing. He had the Lord. And we'll turn to go back to 2 Samuel 15, and we'll just carry on from verse 32. It came to pass when David was come to the top of the mount where he worshipped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. So Hushai, he was another advisor, another counselor, but one who stayed faithful to David. Verse 33, unto whom David said, if thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden unto me. But if thou return to the city and say unto Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now also be thy servant, then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. So what he's saying to this Hushai is, look, don't come with me, don't flee into the wilderness with me, you'll only slow me down, to be honest, Hushai. I don't know, maybe he was elderly or probably wasn't as tough and strong fit as David, who was obviously a bit of a physical soldier of a man. So he's saying, look, don't come with me, you'll be a burden to me, you'll slow me down. But what you can do for me is you can be a bit of a double agent. It's getting a bit spy, bit James Bond here. He's saying to Hushai, right, you go, you say to Absalom that you're going to help him, that you're going to advise him, but the real plan is you're going to frustrate and you're going to defeat the advice that Ahithophel's giving him. So that was David's plan. So it's interesting how he prayed to the Lord. David prayed to the Lord to turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness, but he also took action himself. And I don't believe that was from lack of faith, because he still had to trust that, this was a bit of a a bit of a, what do they call it, a Hail Mary of a plan, a bit of a kind of a last-ditch attempt to sort things out. But he acted in faith, and he sent this guy Hushai to be his little spy in the camp of Absalom, to be his little double agent, who would try and give advice to Absalom, but at the same time to frustrate the advice of Ahithophel. And he goes on to say that there were these other people with him, these priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and Hushai could feed back information to David through these guys, so that David would know what Absalom's plans were, would know what was going on in the camp of Absalom. And so that's exactly what Hushai did. So David was a man where he always prayed. You see throughout his life he was a prayerful man. Before he acted, he prayed, and he sought the Lord, and he asked for the Lord's help or the Lord's wisdom or the Lord's guidance. But he didn't just pray and then sit on his hands and wait for the Lord and expect the Lord to do every single thing for him. He prayed and then he acted in faith. And that's a very good example for us to follow. You know, when we pray to the Lord, we do trust in him and we put our faith in him, and we can ask for his guidance and his wisdom, and for him to see action in a situation. But we also act ourselves, but we act in faith and in trusting in the Lord. You know, it reminds me of it's a very bad joke, but there's that old joke where this guy, you know, he prays every week to win the lottery, and every week he prays to win the lottery, and he prays and he prays and he never wins it. He never wins it at all. And one day he's there down on his knees, calling out to God and saying, "Why, Lord? Why won't you just, you know, let me win? This would take away all of my troubles." And he hears back this voice from heaven saying, "You could have at least bought a ticket." And you know, it's a bad joke, but you know, I suppose the illustration is there that, you know, we act in faith. We're not passive. We don't just sit there. We don't just lie down on the grass and, you know, hope that the Lord sorts out everything in our life just because we put it to him in prayer. We go forward. We walk on in faith, and that's exactly what David did. And we'll go to chapter 16, 2 Samuel 16 and verse 15. And Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And it came to pass, when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, was come unto Absalom, that Hushai said unto Absalom, "God save the king, God save the king." And Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this thy kindness to thy friend? Why wentest thou not with thy friend?" So he's saying, you know, why didn't you go with David? I thought you were his friend. And Hushai said unto Absalom, "Nay, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him will I abide." Now, he's being quite sneaky there, Hushai, because he's not saying, "Well, I will follow you, Absalom." He's saying, well, whoever the Lord chooses and the people of Israel choose, that's who I'm going to follow. And he knew, of course, that the Lord had chosen David. So he's been a bit subtle with his language there, but of course, Absalom, you know, took it to mean that Hushai was going to follow Absalom. So he successfully infiltrated the good graces of Absalom. And then verse 20, then said Absalom to Ahithophel, "Give counsel among you what we shall do." And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, "Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong." So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house, and Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. So Ahithophel gave this advice to Absalom to basically go and sleep with all of his father's concubines, and to do it very, very openly. And this was a bit of a show of force, I guess, to say, look, I'm the top dog now. I'm the guy in Jerusalem. I can do what I want. You know, I can go into anyone in my father's household, and I can take whatever I want. But the other reason Ahithophel advised this is because it made a very, very clear break between Absalom and David. Doing this act kind of meant that, you know, there was no going back. There was no going back. It was such a disgraceful thing to do to David that really what Ahithophel wanted to make sure was that this was not just a way for Absalom to gain a bit of power and then eventually to ask for his father's forgiveness. Ahithophel wanted to make sure there was no going back. That Absalom was all in on this. That his side, the side that Ahithophel had chosen, was going to be the winning side and the victorious side, and there was going to be no peace, no reconciliation. That's what Ahithophel wanted. And we come then to the next verse where it says the counsel of Ahithophel was as if a man inquired at the oracle of God. So Ahithophel, he gave good bad advice, if that makes sense. His advice was good in terms of it was reliable and accurate. If this was what Absalom wanted, to take over and make a breach with his father, this was the advice that would be successful. But of course, it was bad advice in the sense that it was wicked advice. It was good advice, that it was accurate, but it was bad advice because it was wicked. Interestingly enough, though, this act that Absalom did, that Ahithophel advised him to do, was actually a fulfillment of a prophecy against David. And we'll just have a look at that. We'll turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 12. And in 2 Samuel 12, this was after David had been confronted by his sin with Bathsheba, when he took another man's wife, committed adultery with her, caused her husband to be killed, and he'd been confronted by this. He acknowledged his sin, he repented of it, and he was forgiven by the Lord. But even though he was forgiven, there were still consequences. There were still consequences. This is something we have to try and explain to our kids sometimes when they've done something wrong, and they say sorry. We get very big, nice apology notes from Zalia on quite a frequent basis. I am sorry. And we say, yeah, you're forgiven, but there's still consequences for your actions. And that's what happened to David as well. He was forgiven, but he'd still done a very, very evil thing, and there were consequences. And one of these consequences, in 2 Samuel 12, this is Nathan, his prophet, speaking. It says, "Now therefore," in verse 10, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before Israel and before the sun." So exactly what the Lord said would be the consequences of David's actions, of his adultery and murder that he committed, that there would be conflict for the rest of his life. And that was true. David was a man of war. He had blood on his hands. He was never free from that conflict. That evil would be raised up against him from his own household. His own son betrayed him. And there was evil from some of his other sons as well. And that this specific thing, that his wives would be taken from him, and what David did in secret would be done openly in front of the whole of Israel. And that's exactly what happened. So even when there is forgiveness, sometimes there are still natural consequences, and that's certainly something that David learned. We'll go back to 2 Samuel chapter 17 now. So Absalom took this advice from Ahithophel, and he went and did it, and people still continued to gather towards Absalom. They saw where the power base was in the country now. And in chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "Moreover, Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night. And I will come upon him while he is weary and weak-handed, and will make him afraid, and all the people that are with him shall flee, and I will smite the king only. And I will bring back all the people unto thee, as the man whom thou seekest is, as if all returned. In other translations, it says, I will bring all the people back to thee as a wife back to her husband. So all the people shall be in peace. And the saying pleased Absalom well, and all the elders of Israel. So he's got a bit of a step further here, Ahithophel, and he's basically volunteered to take an army of men, these 12,000 men, and go and hunt down David and kill him. That's his next piece of advice to Absalom. Right, let's not wait. David's on the back foot here. Let's go out with an army, 12,000 men. Let's hunt David down, your father, by the way, Absalom. Let's hunt your father down, and I'm going to kill him. And he's volunteered to do it himself as well. So why this absolute hatred, clearly, of Ahithophel for David? He was once his advisor, he was once his counselor, his closest confidant, and now he wants to hunt him down and kill him. He's not being passive in this. He's not just flipped over to Absalom's side because he's seen which way the wind's blowing and he wants to be on the right side. There's an active hatred here of David. He wants to hunt him down and destroy him. And we'll have a look at maybe why that is. We're going to have to, again, jump around once or twice, but it will put the pieces together. 2 Samuel 23. 2 Samuel 23. And there's a list at the end of this chapter of David's mighty men. David's mighty men. These were the band of valiant soldiers, I guess you could call him, who went around with David. And these were the tough guys. These were the best of the best. These were the SAS of their time, the absolute elites. Okay, and we'll read in verse 34, 2 Samuel 23. It says, Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai, I haven't practiced all these names, and the son of the Maachathite. And then here's the one I want to look at. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel. So Ahithophel's son, Eliam, was one of David's mighty men. Who else was one of David's mighty men? Verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. So Ahithophel's son was one of the mighty men along with Uriah. And then if we go to 2 Samuel 11, and verse 3. So David had spied this woman, Bathsheba, that he'd set his eyes on. And verse 3, David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, who was the son of Ahithophel. Bathsheba was Ahithophel's granddaughter. So now we put the pieces together here. His son's probably best friend, Uriah, had married his granddaughter, Bathsheba. And what had David done to Bathsheba? Well, he'd taken her away from her husband. He'd caused her husband, Uriah, to be murdered. The child that she had with David, that she was pregnant with, had died because of David's sin, because he'd done the wrong thing. And so we see now why maybe Ahithophel had this great hatred for David, because he saw what David had done to his granddaughter Bathsheba, his granddaughter's husband, that he got Uriah killed, and his potential great-grandson or great-great-granddaughter, the child that Bathsheba had died, and it was all because of David's sin. So we see here that Ahithophel must have been carrying this grudge in his heart against what David had done to his granddaughter, and he'd been staying by David's side, keeping himself quiet. Maybe David didn't think he knew what he'd done, or maybe David thought that he'd got past it. But he'd been carrying this bitterness in his heart. And thanks to this bitterness, he'd been a big part of tearing apart a whole kingdom and wanting to hunt David down and kill him. So all of this may have been done out of spite and bitterness. And bitterness is a very dangerous trap to fall into, because Ahithophel's bitterness was pretty justified. David did a terrible, terrible thing. If your granddaughter was there, happy in a marriage, and someone else had come along and taken her away forcefully, killed her husband, you'd feel pretty bitter towards that person. He was justified. But the dangerous thing is, it doesn't actually matter if your anger and your bitterness is justified or not. It's still going to do the same damage to you. We'll just go to Hebrews chapter 12 just to see what the consequences of bitterness are and why it's so important that we do not allow bitterness to live within our hearts, whether it's justified or not. In Hebrews 12, verse 14, it says, "Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled." So if we have this root of bitterness springing up within us, it will only lead us to destruction. It'll lead us to not holiness, not where we're set apart and sanctified for the Lord. It will lead us away from the grace of God, and it will defile us. It will cause us to become unclean in the sight of God, because we will not have that forgiveness in our heart. So here's the strong encouragement here from the Lord. Do not let bitterness spring up in your heart, whether it's justified or not. That's what Ahithophel did. And as we'll see, it didn't lead him to any good place. Didn't lead him to any good place at all. So we'll just go back to 2 Samuel 17. So Ahithophel, again here, giving some very good, bad advice. So his advice was very good in the sense that if followed, Absalom would be victorious. He would have rooted David out. David was definitely on the back foot at this point. If Ahithophel had hunted him down and killed him, well, that would have been the end of David. That would have been the end of the promises. That would have been the end of all of the anointing of God and everything that would come after that. Of course, we know that did not happen. That's not going to be a shock to anyone that David was not killed. And we'll see how that was turned. So in 2 Samuel 17, from verse 5, "Then said Absalom, call now Hushai the Archite also, David's double agent, a spy in the camp, and let us hear likewise what he said. And when Hushai was come to Absalom, Absalom spake unto him, saying, Ahithophel hath spoken after this manner. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou." So should we follow it, Ahithophel's advice, or have you got other ideas? And Hushai said unto Absalom, "The counsel that Ahithophel had given is not good at this time." And just for time, we won't read every single verse, but basically Hushai, he advises Absalom. He says, look, don't go after David now. You know how tough he is. You know he's got his mighty men with him. You know how strong they are. David's going to hide himself away in a little cave, a little hole. You're not going to find him. His mighty men, they're going to kill some of your men, and the news is going to spread throughout all the land, and people are going to start fearing David once again, because they're going to hear about how his mighty men have been victorious against your men, and it's not going to be good for you. So what we should do instead, we should wait. We should gather together all of Israel to you, Absalom, and then as a whole nation, we should go out and hunt David down. And even if he's hiding in a city, we can just pull down the whole city and we can find him wherever he's hiding. And that way we can win. That was his advice to Absalom. Let's just wait, gather together this huge army of everyone in the nation, and then we can hunt your father down and win. And verse 14, it says, and Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. So David's prayer here was heard. David's prayer here was acted upon by the Lord. It was by God, really, that Absalom preferred to listen to the advice of Hushai. But it did also make me think that, you know, he had these two pieces of advice. Absalom, he had the advice of Ahithophel, which was, right, let's go, let's act on it now, let's do what needs to be done. And he had the advice of Hushai, which was, let's just, you know, wait, yeah, we will do it, but we'll do it better if we do it later. And actually, Ahithophel's advice was, from Absalom's point of view, it was the right advice. It was the good advice. And sometimes we often get counsel from God to do something. The Lord will put something on our heart that is the right thing to do, that needs to be done. And, you know, we feel that prodding by the Spirit. The Lord gives us a godly conscience, and he puts something on our heart that needs to be done. And really, we should probably just, as soon as the Lord puts it on our heart, we should just act upon it. But sometimes we're a little bit like Absalom, and we want to hear another bit of advice. You know, we want a second opinion on that, and we'll take our own second opinion on that, which is, oh yeah, I know that is something I need to do, but maybe I'll just put it off until tomorrow. Maybe I'll do it next week. Maybe next month. I know, Lord, that's something I need to do, Lord, but I'll do it. Yeah, I'll work myself up to it, and then I'll do a better job of it for you, Lord. And that's not always the best counsel to follow. You know, when the Lord puts something on our hearts to do, and we know it's the leading of the Lord, and we know it's the right thing to do, we're better off just to go and do it, just to go and act upon that, and not listen to, you know, the other counsel, which is the counsel of the flesh, which tells us, oh no, let's put that off and wait. You know, the word tells us to wait on the Lord, and that is good. But should the Lord be waiting on us? Should the Lord be waiting on us when he gives us an instruction, when he gives us some counsel, some advice by the Spirit? Should the Lord be, he is patient and gracious, fortunately for us, but should he need to be? Should he need to be? Or should we act on the good counsel of God when he gives it to us? If there's something the Lord puts it on our heart to do, we should just go out and do it. And Ahithophel saw that his advice was not going to be listened to. Verse 23, it says that when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he was wise enough to know that as soon as David had a little bit of time to regroup, David would be back. David would be back, and it would not go well for Ahithophel after all that he'd done for David. So he knew that was it. The end was nigh. He didn't even need to wait and see what happened. He had the wisdom to know that as soon as the advice was not followed, to stamp this thing out straight away, that it was not going to end well for Absalom. So when he saw his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass, he arose, he gat him home to his house, to his city, he put his household in order, he was organized, and then he hanged himself and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. What a waste. What a waste of wisdom. This was a man who had, in the natural, incredible wisdom to know what was the best course of action in every situation. But at the end of it, was he a wise man? Was he a wise man? He had that wisdom, and he used it for his own purposes, not for the purposes of God. And at the end of the day, it was all a waste. It was all a waste. It was a nation that had been broken in half, a kingship that had been damaged, his life that had been wasted to the point where he killed himself, and there was nothing left to show for it. And we'll go to Psalm 41 just to see another verse that David may have written about Ahithophel. Psalm 41, but imagine all of that potential that Ahithophel had to do good deeds. Imagine the greatness that he could have advised David towards, and instead he threw it all away for his own ends. And in Psalm 41, verse 9, it says, "Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." I don't know if this is about Ahithophel. It's about someone else who betrayed David, maybe. Let's say there's a few people who betrayed him, but it could well still be about Ahithophel. But it's interesting, this verse is quoted in the New Testament, in John 13, about Judas. About Judas. He that eateth bread, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me, mine own familiar friend who I trusted. So after it all, Ahithophel he's a type, he's an example, he's a bit of a foreshadowing of Judas, who ended up with his betrayal in the same end of hanging himself. And he killed himself in the exact same way as Ahithophel. And it just made me think about the potential of Judas. He was there. He must have done many wonderful works. We read of many examples where the disciples went out and they preached the gospel, they healed people, they cast out demons, and Judas was there that whole time. But at the end of the day, the greed or the fear or those things that he let in wasted every potential that he had. And there's so many examples. I won't read them all for time, but we know them very well in the New Testament, that you are what you do. You are what you do. And the Lord gives us all a different nature. We all have different strengths, different gifts, different talents, if you want to say it that way. We all have so much potential in us to do the work of God. And the difference between whether we fulfill that potential or not is, are we acting upon what the Lord has guided us towards? Are we making that good thing that the Lord has put on our heart a habit? Is it something that we are doing continually? Because that will form our godly character. You look at the parable of the talents, the unfaithful servant was the one who didn't act. He didn't act. He just buried that talent in the ground. He did nothing with it. You look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who was the good neighbor? He was the one who acted. He was the one who went out and did the acts of compassion. The sheep and the goats, when Jesus talked about dividing the sheep and the goats, the sheep are the ones who acted in compassion. The sheep are the ones who saw the needs of those in darkness in this world, and went out and cared for the souls of men. Those were the sheep. And there's a thing which is used in a few different forms of life called the duck test. And the duck test is, you might not be an expert on different forms of bird life, for example. But someone said, I didn't write down who coined it, but he said, if I see a bird that quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, has feathers like a duck, webbed feet like a duck, hangs around with ducks, I'm going to assume that's a duck. So what it's talking about is you can identify something by how it acts. And if you call yourself a Christian, but you don't speak like a Christian, you don't act like a Christian, you don't live your life like a follower of Jesus Christ, are you a Christian? James, in the book of James, we read that faith without works is dead. If we have faith and we do not act upon it, the word tells us our faith is dead. And we'll just finish in Romans chapter 2. And so that example of Ahithophel, it's a cautionary tale in so many ways, that when the Lord has given us a gift, and we've all received a gift from the Lord, we've all received the gift of the Holy Ghost, and that empowers us to go forward in the work of God, empowers us to be his his messengers, his postmen, as Brian called it, delivering the message. We need to act upon it. In Romans 2, verse 28, it says, "For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." And of course, this is talking about, on the inside. But what is on the inside, the character that we have, whether we are godly and holy and faithful and righteous, that is formed by our actions and our habits. We are not to be only Christians on the inside. We are to be followers of Christ on the outside as well. And we're not to be like Ahithophel, who uses the things that God has given him for his own ends and his own purposes. God has given us really